It was just another busy morning at Kennedy International Airport. The summer sun was barely peeking through the clouds as passengers rushed to catch their flights. Among them was a young man in his early 30s, dressed in a simple black t-shirt and jeans, carrying a well-worn backpack. He could have been any other traveler, but there was something different about the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence that went unnoticed by most. As he waited in the economy line to board flight AC-247 to Los Angeles, he watched people in first-class boarding with their designer luggage and pressed suits. A little girl in the line pointed at a massive airplane through the window, tugging at her mother's sleeve with excitement. He smiled, remembering how he used to do the same thing when his father first brought him to the airfield. "Boarding Group C, you may now start boarding," announced the gate agent. He joined the slow-moving line, purposely taking his time. A businessman in an expensive suit pushed past him, muttering something about being late. The young man just stepped aside politely, letting others go ahead. The flight attendant at the gate barely glanced at his boarding pass, too busy dealing with a passenger complaining about the overhead bin space. Finding his seat in economy class wasn't hard. 23B, middle seat. He settled in, placing his backpack under the seat in front. A suited executive in the window seat gave him a quick once-over before returning to his laptop. On his other side, an elderly woman struggled with her heavy carry-on bag. "Let me help you with that," he offered, standing up to lift her bag into the overhead compartment. The woman thanked him warmly, but a snicker from a few rows ahead caught his attention. A first-class passenger who was still settling in made a show of rolling his eyes at the economy class scene. As more passengers boarded, he observed the crew going about their pre-flight routine. He noticed small details others might miss, how the lead flight attendant double-checked the emergency exits, the subtle way the ground crew communicated with hand signals, the distinct sound of the fuel transfer pumps. These weren't things most passengers would pick up on. But then again, he wasn't most passengers. A baby started crying somewhere in the back, and he watched how different passengers reacted. Some put on their headphones, others sighed dramatically, but the flight attendants handled it with practiced ease, offering the mother help and reassurance. That's when he overheard two passengers discussing the airline's recent stock performance. "Can't believe how this airline's gone downhill," one said loudly enough for others to hear. "They'll let anyone fly these days." The comment was followed by a pointed glance in his direction. He pulled out his phone, pretending not to notice as he sent a quick text. "On board AC-247. Economy today. You were right, Dad. Seeing everything from this angle is eye-opening." He switched his phone to airplane mode just as the captain's voice came over the intercom, starting the usual pre-flight announcements. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration, and he noticed how some passengers paid attention, while others were lost in their phones or magazines. Little did any of them know that the quiet man in seat 23B could probably recite the entire safety protocol from memory, or that he had logged more flight hours than some of the pilots currently in the cockpit. As the plane began taxiing, he felt the familiar rumble of the engines his father's company had carefully selected for their reliability and efficiency. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling every subtle movement of the aircraft, knowing exactly what was happening in the cockpit at each stage. The story was just beginning, and he was exactly where he needed to be, watching, learning, and preparing for what would come next. The plane had been cruising smoothly for about 30 minutes when things started getting interesting. A loud voice from first class caught everyone's attention. One of the passengers, a man in an expensive gray suit, was making quite a scene about his meal preference. "Do you know how much I paid for this ticket?" His voice carried all the way to the economy section. "I specifically requested the chef's special meal, and this is completely unacceptable." The flight attendant tried to explain that they had no record of his special meal request, but he wasn't having any of it. The young man in 23B watched the situation unfold while helping the elderly woman next to him adjust her air vent. The demanding passenger's voice grew louder. This airline used to have standards. Now look at it. The service, the people they hire, even the passengers they let on board. He shot a disapproving look toward the economy section. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A mother pulled her children closer, trying to distract them with a tablet. The flight attendant, maintaining her professionalism, offered the angry passenger alternative meal options, but he dismissed them all. "I want to speak to someone in charge," he demanded. Surely there must be someone on this flight who understands quality service. The irony of his statement wasn't lost on the quiet observer in economy class, who continued watching the scene with careful attention. Just then, the elderly woman beside him started feeling unwell. The air conditioning was blowing too strongly, and she was shivering. Without hesitation, he took off his light jacket and offered it to her. "Please use this," he said kindly. "I'm actually quite warm." The first-class passenger, who was still making a fuss, noticed this interaction and couldn't resist commenting. "Well, isn't that sweet? Economy class showing us all how it's done." His sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a knife. At least some people know their place. A few passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. The young man simply smiled and helped the elderly woman adjust the jacket around her shoulders. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. "You remind me of my grandson, always thinking of others." The tension in the cabin was interrupted by a slight shudder of the plane. Most passengers barely noticed it, but our observer in 23B recognized it immediately. Something wasn't quite right with one of the engines. He noticed the slight change in the engine's pitch, a subtle vibration that most would miss. The first-class passenger was still going on about the airline standards when the seatbelt sign suddenly came on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor technical difficulties. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The demanding passenger finally quieted down, his face showing a hint of concern. Meanwhile, the young man in economy observed the flight attendants' faces as they moved through the cabin, picking up on their worried glances. He could tell they were trying to maintain their professional composure, but something was definitely wrong. A flight attendant hurried past his seat, and he caught a fragment of her whispered conversation with her colleague. "Need someone with technical expertise," the captain said. Their concerned expressions told him everything he needed to know. The plane shuddered again, slightly stronger this time. The cabin grew quiet, except for a few nervous whispers. The first-class passenger who had been complaining earlier was now gripping his armrests tightly, his previous arrogance replaced by visible anxiety. The young man in economy class took a deep breath. He knew exactly what was happening with the aircraft, and more importantly, he knew how to help. But revealing his identity would change everything. He looked around at the worried faces of his fellow passengers, including the elderly woman next to him who was still wearing his jacket. The decision wasn't hard to make. It was time to stand up. The tension in the cabin was growing with each passing minute. Another shudder ran through the plane, and this time everyone felt it. The quiet observer in economy class noticed the flight attendants huddled near the galley, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. He could read their body language. They were discussing whether anyone on board might have aircraft expertise. A young mother across the aisle clutched her child closer, trying to distract him with a tablet that he no longer seemed interested in. The businessman who had been so focused on his laptop earlier had now closed it, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest. Even the demanding first-class passenger had fallen silent, his earlier complaints forgotten in the face of real concern. The elderly woman beside him touched his arm gently. "Are you all right, dear? You seem deep in thought." He gave her a reassuring smile, but his mind was racing. He knew exactly what was happening. The port engine was experiencing fluctuations in its compression system. It wasn't catastrophic, but it needed immediate attention from someone who understood the aircraft's systems intimately. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady but with an edge of concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to experience some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and seated. Our crew is handling the situation." The young man noticed something in the captain's tone that others might miss. They needed help, but were trying not to alarm the passengers. He watched as one of the flight attendants made her way through the cabin, trying to maintain a calm appearance while clearly looking for someone. She paused briefly at each row, scanning faces, probably checking the passenger manifest in her mind for anyone with technical credentials. The plane lurched slightly to the left. A few passengers gasped. A child started crying somewhere in the back. The formerly demanding passenger from first class was now repeatedly pressing his call button, his previous arrogance replaced by poorly concealed panic. Our observer took a deep breath. His father's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes leadership means stepping up when others need you, not when it's convenient for you. He had spent years learning every aspect of these aircraft, from the simplest maintenance checks to the most complex emergency procedures. He knew this plane like the back of his hand. After all, his family's company had helped design it. He noticed the lead flight attendant making another pass through the cabin, this time more urgently. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw the worry she was trying to hide. The engine sound changed pitch again. Subtle, but to his trained ear, it was like an alarm bell. The elderly woman was still wearing his jacket, now clutching it tightly around her shoulders. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He patted her hand gently. "It's going to be okay," he assured her, and he meant it. Another flight attendant rushed past, carrying a stack of forms, probably the passenger manifest, looking for anyone with aviation experience. The young man knew it was time to act. He had wanted to remain anonymous, to observe and learn as his father had suggested. But some things were more important than learning experiences. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up slowly. A few nearby passengers looked at him with confusion. Nobody was supposed to be standing right now. The flight attendant turned around at the sound of movement, ready to ask him to return to his seat. What happened next would change everything. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small leather wallet. Inside was not just any ID, but credentials that would shock everyone on board. The same passengers who had ignored him, the first-class traveler who had looked down on him, the crew who had barely noticed him. They were all about to learn an important lesson about assumptions. As he calmly made his way toward the flight attendant, he could feel eyes following him. The story was about to take an unexpected turn, and he knew that after this moment, nothing would be quite the same. Time seemed to slow down as he approached the lead flight attendant. Her eyes widened slightly as he pulled out his credentials, not just a pilot's license, but an executive badge showing he was the owner's son. She quickly glanced at the ID, then back at his face, realization dawning in her eyes. "I understand there might be an issue with the port engine," he said quietly, keeping his voice calm to avoid alarming nearby passengers. "I'm rated to fly this aircraft type, and I know these systems inside out." He smiled reassuringly as her expression shifted from surprise to relief. The flight attendant quickly led him toward the front of the plane. As they passed the first-class section, the demanding passenger from earlier did a double take. Just an hour ago, he had been looking down at this young man in economy class. Now, seeing the pilot's wings gleaming on his ID badge, the passenger's face flushed with embarrassment. They reached the cockpit door, and the flight attendant pressed the intercom. "Captain, I have someone here you need to meet." After proper security protocols, the door opened. The captain turned, surprise flickering across his face as he took in the young man's appearance, then his credentials. "Sir, the captain began, but the young man raised his hand. "Please, no formalities. I'm here to help if you need it." His humble tone put everyone at ease. The captain nodded, quickly explaining the situation with the engine. Just as suspected, there was an issue with the compression system. Back in the cabin, word was beginning to spread. Whispers traveled from row to row. The quiet guy from economy, owner's son, a pilot. The elderly woman who still wore his jacket smiled knowingly, as if she had sensed something special about him all along. In the cockpit, he worked seamlessly with the flight crew, his years of training evident in every move and decision. His father had insisted he learn every aspect of their aircraft, from the ground up. "You can't lead what you don't understand," his father always said. Now those lessons were proving their worth. The first officer watched in admiration as the young executive diagnosed the issue and suggested a solution. His hands moved across the control panel with practiced ease, adjusting settings and monitoring responses. The engine's pitch gradually stabilized. Through the cockpit window, he could see the curve of the Earth meeting the sky. This view never got old, no matter how many times he'd seen it. But today wasn't about enjoying the view. It was about ensuring everyone's safety and showing true leadership. The captain made an announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to report that our technical issue has been resolved. We have an experienced pilot that we were fortunate to have on board who helped us address the situation. We'll be continuing to our destination as planned." A collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin. Some passengers applauded. The first-class passenger who had been so difficult earlier sank deeper into his seat, his face a mix of embarrassment and relief. The young man stayed in the cockpit for a while longer, monitoring the engine's performance. He thought about his father's words about humility and service. Today had proven those lessons right. True respect isn't about where you sit on the plane, but about how you treat others and step up when needed. As he prepared to return to his seat in economy, the captain shook his hand warmly. "Thank you," he said simply. But it wasn't just gratitude for helping with the engine. It was appreciation for showing that leadership and expertise don't always come in the packages people expect. The story of what happened that day would soon spread throughout the airline industry. But for now, there was still a flight to complete, and he knew exactly where he would spend the rest of it. Back in seat 23B, next to the elderly woman who had shown him kindness without knowing who he was. Walking back through first class, everything felt different. The same aisle he had walked down as a regular passenger now seemed to carry a different energy. The demanding passenger who had caused such a scene earlier caught his eye, then quickly looked away, suddenly very interested in his magazine. A young flight attendant who had barely noticed him before now stood straighter, a look of admiration in her eyes. But he gave her the same warm smile he'd given earlier when he was just another passenger in economy. His father's words rang in his ears. Character isn't about how you act when people know who you are, but how you treat others when they don't. As he made his way back, passengers who had overheard the story watched him with newfound respect. Some nodded in acknowledgement, others smiled, and a few even reached out to shake his hand. The businessman who had pushed past him during boarding now looked particularly uncomfortable, adjusting his tie nervously. The elderly woman was still in her seat, still wearing his jacket. Her eyes lit up as he approached. "I knew there was something special about you," she said warmly. "You have that same kindness in your eyes that my late husband had. He was a mechanic for 40 years, and he always said you can tell a person's character by how they treat others when they think nobody's watching." He settled back into his seat, politely declining offers from the flight attendants to move him to first class. "I'm quite comfortable here," he said, meaning every word. The mother across the aisle, who had been anxiously holding her child during the engine trouble, mouthed a quiet thank you. The formerly demanding passenger from first class appeared in the aisle, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. I owe you an apology," he stammered, his earlier arrogance completely deflated. "My behavior was inexcusable, and I'm deeply embarrassed." The young executive listened quietly, then replied with genuine kindness. "Thank you for saying that. Perhaps we can all remember that expertise and ability don't always come in the packages we expect." The passenger nodded, humbled, and returned to his seat with a thoughtful expression. Throughout the cabin, the atmosphere had changed. Passengers who had been strangers just hours ago were now chatting quietly, sharing their experiences of the tense moments. The incident had broken down invisible barriers between classes and seats, reminding everyone that they were all just people sharing a journey. A little girl from a few rows ahead approached shyly, clutching the small toy airplane. "Are you really a pilot?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. He smiled and spent a few minutes explaining how airplanes fly, using simple terms she could understand. Her mother watched with grateful tears in her eyes, seeing her daughter's fear of flying transform into fascination. The lead flight attendant passed by with refreshments, insisting on serving him first despite his protests. "It's not about the special treatment," she explained quietly. "It's about thanking you for showing us all something important today." As the plane continued its journey, he pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his father. "Dad, today I learned more about our airline than any executive meeting could have taught me. You were right. True leadership isn't about titles or seat assignments. It's about being ready to help when needed and treating everyone with respect, no matter who they are or where they sit." The elderly woman beside him had dozed off peacefully, still wearing his jacket. The demanding passenger was now quietly helping a young mother store her bags properly. Somewhere behind him, he could hear the little girl still excitedly explaining to her stuffed animal how planes stay in the sky. The story of what happened on this flight would be told many times, but perhaps its greatest impact was in the small changes it created, in how people saw each other, and in how they understood that dignity and ability don't depend on where you sit or what you wear. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, the young executive found himself deep in conversation with the elderly woman beside him. She shared stories about her late husband's days as an aircraft mechanic, and he listened intently, picking up bits of wisdom that even his years of technical training hadn't taught him. "My husband always said that every bolt and every screw has a story," she said, her eyes twinkling. "Just like every passenger on this plane has one." He nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Today had proven that truth in more ways than one. The captain's voice came over the intercom, updating everyone about their approach to LAX. This time, the announcement carried a different tone, one of deep respect and gratitude. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for landing, I want to personally thank our special passenger who helped us earlier. His actions today remind us that greatness often comes in unexpected packages." In first class, the previously demanding passenger was now helping the flight attendants collect trash, as if trying to make amends for his earlier behavior. Every time he passed by economy class, he glanced at the young executive with a mix of respect and lingering embarrassment. A flight attendant stopped by his row. "Sir," she said quietly, "the crew would like to know if we could take a photo with you after landing. You've inspired all of us today." He agreed, but with one condition: that everyone in the crew be included, from the captain to the ground staff waiting at the gate. The little girl who had been fascinated by his pilot stories came back one more time, this time with a drawing she had made during the flight. It showed an airplane with hearts around it, and at the bottom, in crooked childish letters, were the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe." He carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his pocket, touched by the simple honesty of a child's gratitude. As they began their final approach, he helped the elderly woman prepare for landing, making sure her seatbelt was secure and her belongings safely stowed. She patted his hand and said, "You know, when I first sat down next to a young man in economy class, I never expected to meet someone who would remind me so much of my husband's kindness." He too believed that true respect is earned, not demanded. The businessman who had been so focused on his laptop earlier turned to him and asked, "Why did you choose to sit in economy? You could have had any seat on this plane." The young executive smiled and explained, "My father taught me that to truly understand something, you need to experience it from every angle. How can I make decisions about passenger comfort if I've never sat in these seats?" Through the window, the lights of Los Angeles began to appear below. The same passengers who had ignored or dismissed him hours ago were now hanging on his every word. A young mother 2 rows back was recording a video on her phone, probably sharing the story on social media. The plane touched down smoothly, and as they taxied to the gate, spontaneous applause broke out, not just for the landing, but for everything that had happened during the flight. The young executive joined in, clapping for the skilled flight crew who had handled the situation so professionally. As passengers began to gather their belongings, many lingered, not wanting the experience to end. The story of what happened on this flight was already spreading through messages and calls to loved ones waiting at the airport. But the real impact wasn't in the story itself. It was in how it changed the way people saw each other. The elderly woman finally returned his jacket, but not before writing her contact information on a small piece of paper. "Please stay in touch," she said. "The world needs more young leaders like you who understand that true authority comes from character, not position." The arrival gate at Los Angeles International Airport was buzzing with unusual energy. As passengers began deplaning, many were already sharing the story with those waiting to greet them. Phone cameras captured the moment as the young executive emerged from the jetway, still walking alongside the elderly woman from seat 23C. Airport staff who had heard snippets of the story over their radios gathered discreetly, trying to catch a glimpse of the owner's son who had chosen economy class and ended up saving the day. But he wasn't focused on the attention. He was making sure his elderly seatmate was safely reunited with her waiting grandson. "Grandma," called out a young man in his 20s, rushing forward to help with her bags. "I heard there was some excitement on your flight." The elderly woman's eyes sparkled as she gestured to her former seatmate. This wonderful young man not only gave me his jacket, but turned out to be quite the hero. The formerly difficult first-class passenger was now standing nearby, having waited specifically to speak with the executive again. His designer suit couldn't hide his humble demeanor. "I've been thinking about my behavior," he said quietly. "I realize now that I've become exactly the kind of person I used to criticize when I was starting out in business." News of what happened was spreading through the terminal. Gate agents from other airlines walked by, trying to appear casual while stealing glances. A group of young aviation students on their way to flight school stopped to watch, whispering excitedly among themselves when they recognized the airline owner's son. The flight crew gathered for the promised photo, but the young executive insisted that it be taken in front of the gate, not in some VIP area. "This is where the real work happens," he explained. The ground crew, baggage handlers, and gate agents were all invited to join. Someone noticed that the cleaning staff were hanging back, unsure if they should participate. He specifically walked over and asked them to join the photo. As they posed for the picture, a small crowd of onlookers gathered. The little girl who had given him the airplane drawing was perched on her father's shoulders, waving excitedly. The elderly woman's grandson was recording the whole scene on his phone, already live streaming to his social media followers. "You've started something really special here," one of the flight attendants said as they checked the photos. "People are going to be talking about this for a long time." She was right. Posts about the flight were already going viral on social media. The hashtag economy class hero was trending. A young baggage handler approached nervously. "Sir," he said, "I've been trying to get into flight school, but it's been hard. Seeing you today, well, it shows that anything is possible if you work hard enough." The executive pulled out his business card, wrote a personal email address on the back, and told the young man to send him his application. The elderly woman's grandson finally managed to pull her away, but not before she gave the executive a warm hug. "Don't forget to write," she reminded him. "And remember what I told you about my husband. Every person has a story worth hearing." As the crowd began to disperse, the terminal returning to its usual rhythm, one of the gate agents approached with tears in her eyes. "My daughter is the only black girl in her aviation club," she said softly. "She keeps being told she doesn't look like a pilot. Wait until I tell her about today." Looking around the terminal, the young executive saw something remarkable happening. The first-class passenger was helping a mother with her stroller. The businessman who had rushed past him during boarding was now offering his phone charger to a stranded traveler. Small acts of kindness were spreading like ripples in a pond. He pulled out his phone one last time to message his father. "Dad, today showed me that change doesn't always come from big announcements or policy meetings. Sometimes it comes from a simple choice to sit in seat 23B and treat everyone with the same respect. regardless of their seat assignment or uniform. 1 week after the flight, the story had taken on a life of its own. The airline's headquarters was flooded with messages from people around the world who had been touched by what happened. Social media couldn't get enough of the young executive who had chosen economy class and ended up changing perspectives about leadership and prejudice. In his office overlooking the airport, the young executive was reading through emails when his father walked in. The older man's face carried a proud smile. "So," he said, settling into a chair, "I hear seat 23B has become quite famous." They both laughed, remembering how a simple choice of seating had led to such an unexpected chain of events. The elderly woman had kept her promise to stay in touch. Her first email included photos her grandson had taken at the gate, along with a surprising request. She asked if the airline would consider starting a mentorship program for young people interested in aviation careers. "My husband always said that talent can come from anywhere," she wrote. "We just need to give it a chance to shine." That morning, the executive had received another unexpected message. The demanding first-class passenger had written a lengthy email about how the experience had changed him. He had started a scholarship fund for underprivileged students interested in aviation, naming it after his own grandfather, who had worked as an airport janitor while saving for flight school. The little girl's drawing now hung framed on his office wall, right next to his pilot's license. Her mother had sent a message saying that her daughter now wanted to become a pilot, and had started reading every book about airplanes she could find. "You didn't just save a flight that day," the mother wrote. "You gave my daughter permission to dream bigger." The baggage handler who had approached him at the gate was now enrolled in flight school, his tuition partially covered by a new program the airline had created. Other airlines had started reaching out, wanting to know more about their approach to inclusive hiring and leadership development. During a meeting with the airline's board of directors, the young executive proposed something unprecedented: a complete redesign of their training program. "Every executive should spend time in economy class," he explained. "Every manager should work alongside our ground crew. We can't lead what we don't understand." The flight crew from that day had become minor celebrities in their own right. The lead flight attendant was invited to speak at a conference about customer service and leadership. She told the story of how the owner's son had treated her with the same respect both before and after revealing his identity. Social media continued to buzz with the story. The hashtag economy class era had evolved into a movement about breaking down prejudices and assumptions. People shared their own stories of times they had been judged by their appearance or position, and how they overcame those judgments. A documentary filmmaker had reached out, wanting to tell the story of how one flight had sparked a conversation about leadership, prejudice, and human dignity. The young executive agreed on one condition: that the film focus not just on him, but on all the people who made the airline run, from the cleaning staff to the pilots. In the airport terminal, something subtle but significant had changed. Passengers were treating airline staff with more respect. First-class travelers were less demanding. Economy passengers felt more valued, and there was a general sense that everyone was part of the same journey. The young executive kept his economy seat on future flights, despite protests from his staff. "Leadership isn't about where you sit," he would say. "It's about how you treat the people around you." He made it a point to learn the names of ground crew members, maintenance staff, and flight attendants, showing through actions that every role mattered. As he walked through the terminal, he often thought about what his father had taught him about understanding every aspect of their business. But now he understood something even more important: that true change doesn't come from policy manuals or corporate memos, but from small acts of respect and dignity that ripple outward in unexpected ways. 6 months later, the airline's main training center was hosting a special ceremony. The young executive stood at the podium, looking out at a diverse crowd of faces: new pilot trainees, flight attendants, maintenance crew, and ground staff. Among them sat the elderly woman from C-23C, now serving as a mentor in their new aviation program. The demanding passenger from first class was there too, but transformed. He had become one of the airline's strongest advocates for inclusive hiring practices. Today, he was presenting scholarships to 5 students who might never have had the chance to pursue their aviation dreams otherwise. The little girl who had given him the airplane drawing was in the audience with her mother. She wore a custom-made pilot's cap, a gift from the airline's crew. Her drawing had inspired a children's book about breaking stereotypes in aviation, with proceeds going to flight school scholarships. When I sat in seat 23B that day, the executive began his speech. I had no idea how many lives would be touched by what happened. But the real story isn't about me. It's about every person who keeps our planes flying, our passengers safe, and our dreams of flight alive. The baggage handler who had approached him at the gate was now halfway through flight school, top of his class. He had started a study group for other students from disadvantaged backgrounds, sharing his knowledge and encouragement. Success means nothing if we don't lift others up with us, he often said, echoing the executive's own words. In the months since that flight, the airline had implemented dramatic changes. The rigid barriers between different employee levels had softened. Executives regularly worked alongside ground crew, gaining first-hand experience of every job. Customer satisfaction scores had soared, not because of luxury perks, but because of the genuine respect shown to every passenger. The flight crew from that memorable day had been promoted to training positions, teaching new staff about the importance of treating everyone with dignity, regardless of their seat assignment or uniform. Their story had become a cornerstone of the airline's training program. Social media still buzzed with updates from the airline's initiatives. The hashtag economy class hero had evolved into hashtag aviation for all, a movement promoting diversity and inclusion in the aviation industry. Other airlines had started adopting similar programs, creating a wave of positive change across the industry. The elderly woman's grandson had turned their story into a viral documentary series about breaking down barriers in aviation. Each episode featured someone who had overcome prejudice to pursue their dreams of flight. The series had already inspired countless young people to consider careers in aviation. Near the end of the ceremony, the executive shared something special. A letter from his father. "My son," it read, "when I told you to learn our business from every angle, I never imagined you would teach us all so much more. You showed us that true leadership isn't about authority or position. It's about seeing the dignity in every person and the potential in every moment." As the ceremony concluded, a surprise guest appeared on the video screen. The captain from that fateful flight. Now retired, he had become a spokesperson for aviation education programs. "What happened that day wasn't just about solving a technical problem," he said. "It was about showing us that excellence and leadership can come from any seat on the plane." The day ended with a special announcement. The airline was launching an international foundation to support aviation education for underserved communities. The first scholarship would be named in honor of the elderly woman's late husband, the mechanic who had believed every bolt, and every person had a story worth knowing. As people mingled after the ceremony, sharing stories and dreams, the young executive stood back and watched. In every conversation, every handshake, every smile, he saw the ripples of change that had started from one simple choice to sit in economy class. The story had done more than change an airline. It had helped change hearts and minds, proving that sometimes the most powerful leadership lessons come from the most unexpected places.